with all the craziness going on, could be our generation and generations past, we've all had something crazy go on. But I think marriage gives you that earthly anchor that for me has helped me sort of define how I move forward and interact with the world. And it gives me that place where I can say, okay, my marriage is my number one thing, right? And my spouse is my number one person. And being able to navigate the world in that mindset with a forever partner is, I think, crucial.
Even more so in a time like this, you should get married, because then you don't have to strive through those things on your own. You have a companion, not only a friend, but also someone to hold you accountable and to hold each other accountable in the Lord.
Well, good morning, fellowship. You're all awake and fresh. To those online, we just got an extra hour's sleep, so that's why we're chipper. And to those in the chapel, good morning to you too. I am Eugene, and my objective this morning is to promote marriage, not just any kind of marriage. I want for you to have, either in your own experience or in the opportunity with others, to aim towards, to work towards, to really succeed in an ordinary marriage. That seems like a strange mandate or encouragement. It's normally, I want you to have an extraordinary marriage. I want you to be special. I want you to reach beyond the norms of what's commonplace, and I want you to get to the pinnacle. I want you to have the very best, most magnificent, spectacular marriage. If you have that, that's well and good. But what I really would like for you this morning is to have something that's a little more modest, maybe even mundane. I want for you as a Christian to promote and some experience a very ordinary marriage. And the reason I say this is not just because I'm trying to be realistic in my expectations for people, but because I read the Bible. And so if you have your Bibles, let's turn to the book of Ruth so we can celebrate ordinariness together. Now, the book of Ruth is one of my absolute favorites. If you're looking for a love story, there is, of course, the Song of Solomon. But with characters involved, a narrative love story, there's no beating the story of Ruth, right? It's one of those great stories where you have someone who's down on their luck and they meet another individual and there is mutual attraction and there is a wedding and everything is restored in the end. That's all there. But you got to know the backstory to appreciate it. So the story of Ruth starts in the preceding book, which is the story of the Judges. And if you want some disturbed reading, read Judges. It's a great book to read in October, right? When everybody is talking about that which is frightening, by all means, read the book of Judges. It's this long, slow degrading of God's people. So before that, the people have entered into the land of promise. Everything that they've been promised has been fulfilled, and they've taken this great gift of God's providence and they've squandered it. From one generation to the next, they become more and more like the Canaan people. They lose their holy disposition. They start behaving in the most profane, ungodly ways. It's disheartening reading. It's dark days characterized by chaos and selfishness and key individuals reaching and taking that which they shouldn't. And in the midst of that, you have the book of Ruth. So Ruth starts with, in the time of the Judges. That doesn't just give you a chronological time for it, it gives you the context. In a dark and bewildering period, this happens. Now, the book is called Ruth, but it actually starts by talking, and actually ends with her as well, this woman by the name of Naomi. Naomi means sweet. So you get this idea that she has this pleasant disposition. And she comes from an insignificant little town that you actually know, Bethlehem. And she and her husband Elimelech have two sons. The problem they're having is that not only is there chaos around them, there's actually famine too. And so there's no real opportunity to make a life, so they decide to immigrate. They go to Moab, a neighboring country, and they live there for 10 years. The boys find girls, they marry. Looks like they have a future. And then inexplicably and unexplained, all the guys die. So if you're a man, it's not a great book for you. Dad dies, both boys die. If you're a girl, not a great story for you either. You're suddenly widowed, all three of them. Naomi and these two Moabite girls. Now the one decides she's going to stay. The other decides to return with Naomi back to Bethlehem. Her name is Ruth. When these two get back, and they get back to Bethlehem, Naomi is immediately recognized. And the ladies come out and give her a welcome, and they say, Naomi, it's great to see you. And she responds. And so look at chapter 1, verse 20. This is Naomi. She said to them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. And this is a play on words. Naomi means sweet, Mara means bitter. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity on me? That's a pretty dark greeting. You greet this person, Naomi, sweetness, it's so good to see you. And she goes, that's not my name anymore. Don't call me that. I'm an altogether different person. I went away full. I've come back empty. I went looking for a better life, and I found nothing but death and loss. And I have come back, and I am bitter. And I'm sure you've met bitter people. She names it, and she claims it, and she's living it. But the truth is, she's not altogether empty, though, is she? Because she comes back with a daughter-in-law who's also a widow, and her name is Ruth. And Ruth is one of these rare characters who's defined by good character. She is a loyal, loving, faithful, industrious, hard-working young woman. She's lost her husband, and she has now left her homeland and followed Naomi all the way to another land she's not familiar with. But she's chosen, I'm going to embrace it like my own. And not only does she do that, she enters into this new society at the very, very bottom. She's a widow. She has no claim to any heritage. There's no inheritance waiting for her. And so her only means of survival is to glean the fields. What that means is when a farmer moves through and his workers cut down the grain, whatever falls, barley in this case, some seeds, some kernels fall to the ground, and those get left behind. And the absolute poor, the disenfranchised, they quietly walk behind the workers, picking up what's left. And this is what Ruth does, without complaint, taking care of her mother-in-law. Now, as the story goes, Boaz, the man who owns the land, man of significance, he recognizes this young woman. Her character shines through, her industriousness, her modesty, her good character is on display. And so he shows kindness to her. She goes home with more than she would normally pick by herself. Naomi finds out about this, and she starts meddling. You know what meddling is? Mother-in-laws know what meddling is. And now normally when a mother-in-law meddles, it's not good. But they meddle because it sometimes works. And that's exactly what happens in this situation. They see there is an opportunity, and so there is this very interesting story of how the two meet. Okay? And once they meet, they then end up getting married, and then they have a child. So, this is Ruth chapter 4, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. May his name be renowned in Israel. So the story concludes with Naomi, who was Mara, now becoming Naomi again. Where there was hopelessness, there is now hope. There is fulfillment. And so there is the story, there's a very clear theme of God's providence in how he cares for and protects his own. That's one theme. But the other theme in this is that God frequently does it through the most ordinary ways. Because what I like about Ruth is that there's nothing extraordinary about this. I mean, it's a great story. There's wonderful character involved, people doing the right thing in the right way. But there are no heroes. There's no great battles. You don't have Samson swinging a donkey's jawbone, killing Philistines. There's no drama in it at all. So there's no national uprising. This is in a small, forgotten town, and it's small, forgettable people. There's no angelic visions, no prophets saying anything. There's no supernatural activity at all. This is a story about ordinary people doing the most ordinary things. And we are presented ultimately with an ordinary marriage. But it's the ordinariness of it that brings the most hope. And that's what I want to communicate to you. Why I want you to have an ordinary marriage or promote ordinary marriages in the lives of others is because, like nothing else, they proclaim hope. Because what a marriage is a declaration of a life together. It is, someone put it this way, marriage is us with a future. I think that's brilliant. Marriage is us with a future. Marriage is a declaration that for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, you and I are doing this together. There is an expectation that there is a future involved. So you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, and you have Adam and Eve, and things are not as they ought to be because Adam is by himself, and so God gives him Eve, and there is this wedding, and it is a promise of a future. And what is even interesting is you turn the page to Genesis 3. Sin comes into the world, and everything falls apart. And you see how marriage strife actually begins, right? Adam and Eve are going, well, it's not my fault. And Adam says, God, you gave me this woman, and she's broken, and it's not on me. And so you see this internal strife. But even there, when God declares his curse, he says of the serpent that the serpent's head will be crushed by the offspring of the woman. So out of this marriage, as fragile as it is, the hope of the future is coming from her descendants. Hope comes through this broken marriage. And now we're going to see in just a little bit that hope comes through Ruth and Boaz too. Every time you see a marriage, it's a declaration of hope. It is two people saying, we're going to build a future together. I mean, people use that language fairly commonly. It's you and me against the world, and we're going to live together. We're going to build a future, which is why if you have a couple walking along the beach and they're just watching young people and delighting in their joy, and then they see an elderly couple moving incredibly slowly along the waves, holding hands, that vision will result in one of the couples just being delighted and grabbing the hand of their spouse. Why? Because that's the promise, that we're going to grow old together, that it's you and me. We're going to lose our beauty, we're going to lose our speed, our dexterity will be gone, but we will have a future together. Marriage, and particularly a wedding, is not a graduation. It feels like that. I know this because in a couple of weeks I'm officiating a wedding. I do that fairly regularly. But in this case, it's my nephew. So it's a family wedding, which means I can't excuse myself from all the activity around the wedding. Normally, I'm there, I do the deed, and I go home. In this situation, all the activity I have a role in. And I'm amazed at how much activity and cost is involved in all of this. It's massive. And it's not unusual that people look at a wedding and go, we're just going to get through it, and then we'll get to the other side. Right? As though that's the activity, that's the graduation, and then we can get back to life. It's not that at all. A marriage is the sound, a wedding at least, the wedding day is the sound of the gun going and the marathon beginning. Yes, it's an enormous celebration, but it isn't a graduation. It marks the beginning of a future together. And this future together could be, and most likely will be, remarkably ordinary. If you get married, there's a chance that you'll have a spectacular marriage and people will know about it. It might be in People magazine or someone on TV will comment on it. Celebrity weddings will have you on the magazine. Is there such a thing? I'm sure there is. Right? It's chance that you're going to have one of these spectacular, important wedding days, but most likely not. It'll be super important to you and your people, but it's going to probably be something that is somewhat mundane and ordinary. You're not going to have Cinderella's story. What you're going to have is a life filled with laundry and taking out the trash and paying a mortgage, raising children, dealing with illness, overcoming financial challenges, figuring out what your priorities are. It's going to be falling into various rhythms that then become ruts. Those ruts become challenges that need to be addressed. It's all incredibly ordinary, but it's that ordinariness, that modesty, that is so important. Because just because something is modest and ordinary doesn't mean it's unimportant. I think gravity is fairly commonplace, right? Lots of gravity going around. Anybody think it's unimportant you want to do without gravity this week? How about oxygen? Lots of oxygen in the world. Everywhere you go, you're just breathing it. You don't give any thought to it. It's just there, sucking it in, blowing it out, giving absolutely no thought. It's everywhere, altogether common, mundane, somewhat a little important maybe. How about water? Covers the vast majority of the globe. It's everywhere. You deal without it for a good while, you'll be missing it. Just because something is ordinary doesn't mean that it's unimportant. Frequently, the ordinary things are super important. It is the familiarity of it, the commonplace, the persistence of it that communicates hope so well. We see this commonality and simplicity in the book of Ruth. And what is important about it is God gives us this hopeful, very ordinary, but very hopeful story in the period of the Judges. It's dark, it's destructive, society is a wreck. And in the midst of all of this, you have this glimpse of hope. It's very ordinary, but the hope shines through. And I think that is enormously important to us where we stand today. You know, our society is not healthy. I don't think anybody has any real question about that. It's never been perfect, but these are difficult days. As a nation and as a globe, things are hard. And people recognize that darkness, and hope seems to go. It goes away. People become less and less encouraged, the more despondent, and they start becoming cynical. And they lose hope in institutions. It's called institutional decay. And so Gallup has been studying people's confidence in the major bulwarks, the the institutions that define society's stability, things like the military and the police and education and medical and media and politics and all of those various institutions, banking, you name it. These are the major institutions that shape society. And so Gallup measures how much confidence people have in these institutions. Shockingly, since 2022, that's only 2 years ago, on an average of 16 different institutions, Americans have lost between 11 and 16% of their confidence. It's this precipitous fall-off. Nobody trusts the institutions. And the problem with that is when you lose hope in those institutions, there is this increase, this equivalent increase in social decay. People stop living according to social norms. People stop acting in ways that are considered normative. And there is a real effort by many who want to involve themselves in restoring institutions, making sure that they can indeed provide light and hope. All for it. But can I say this? Marriage will accomplish more for society than any and every one of those institutions. Marriage will accomplish more for society than any and all of those institutions. In the ordinariness of it, where two people are living their lives, sharing in a life together, it doesn't have to be spectacular. It doesn't have to be perfect. But there is nevertheless this mutual agreement of us with a future that communicates so much more. And as we go into a presidential election week, please vote and then go home and focus on your marriage. Because your marriage will do more for this nation than your vote ever will. It's in your marriage that you display the goodness of God. And here's how it works. What you do is witnessed by others. What is witnessed is internalized. And what is internalized is modeled. What you do is witnessed. What is witnessed is internalized. What is internalized is modeled. Hope moves from observation to living it out as an example to others. Here's this phenomenal example that just happened this week. I got contacted by a young woman who is married with kids. I know her well, but from a long time ago. Years ago, she was a part of fellowship while she was a union student, talking almost 20 years ago. And in those years, she got connected with a family. And she was in their home all the time. Did her laundry there, ate their food, cried over boys, just lived life in their home while a student. Dial forward more than a decade. She and her husband are now doing ministry in El Paso to immigrants, caring for immigrants. She considers it her mission from the Lord. But in her conversation with me, she said that the seed of caring for immigrants was demonstrated first to her in the hospitality shown to her as a student. And I can assure you that the family that was allowing her free rein in the washing machine were not thinking about that. It was just ordinary, mundane living. But what is witnessed is internalized. What is internalized is modeled. Hope moves from the ordinary to the ordinary. And so when you start thinking, I'm just living a very ordinary life here, I want to tell you, yes, indeed, but the collective impact of the church living it out, it cascades. A small impact, and a small impact slowly moves the dial. You want to do good in your society? Emphasize marriage. It's not the only way, but it's an important way. And the book of Ruth tells us that in times when things get really dark, things are really unsure, That's exactly when we should be enjoying marriage the most. I think back to when I was a young man, and next year I celebrate 30 years of marriage. Isn't that awesome? It's fantastic. Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's right. We can all tell Kathy how fortunate she is. 30 years of marriage, and I love it. It's great. It's wonderful. But there was a time in my youth when I thought, I don't want to get married. I don't want to have children. Do you know why? I was living in apartheid South Africa, and there were riots on the streets, and there was mayhem, and people were dying, and there was blood, and the future looked bleak. And I thought to myself, this is not a time for romance. It's certainly not a time to bring children into the world. And I know I'm not the only person who's thought like that, because I study Bonhoeffer. If you don't know who Bonhoeffer was, he was a German pastor and theologian who died in World War II. He was executed by the Nazis. But what is interesting about him is that for the longest period of time, he didn't think he ought to get married. He intentionally avoided it. He wrote to Paul Lehman, an American friend of his, and said, people like us can't get married because life's too nomad-like. We take joy in our work. In other words, he was saying, the work we're doing is so important, it's so important, we don't have time for domestic bliss. We're living in extraordinary times, and ordinary marital bliss, we don't have time for that. It's not wise. Others would go, it's not wise to get married in times like this. It's not wise to have children in times like this. And then he changes his mind. And he changes his mind in the most strange times. Not when things get better, it's when they get really bad. And the Gestapo are hunting him. And eventually they get him. And while he's in prison, he starts writing. And he's writing to young men who are getting married. So let me share a couple of his letters. For here in the midst of the final destruction of all things, one desires to build. In the midst of a life lived from hour to hour and from day to day, one desires a future. In the midst of being driven out of the earth, one desires a bit of space. In the midst of widespread misery, one desires some happiness. What always delights me in news like this is the self-assured glimpse into the future and the confidence that there is a reason to look forward to the next day or the next year, the joyful grasping hold of happiness where God still gives it. There is this, even while he's in prison, looking into the future, saying, there is reason for a hope because God has not abandoned us. And so as you consider marriage, my urgency to you is, don't shoot for the stars, but move towards one another and go, we're going to build a life. And if your life is ordinary and sometimes complicated and often hard and it's mundane, glory in that. Because in the mundane ordinariness of a life lived together, you are proclaiming hope in a future. For God, who institutionalized marriage, is still using it. He uses it in sometimes profound, unexpected ways. So look at Ruth chapter 4, 21 to 22. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. So here you have a story of a destitute woman goes to a strange land. Mother-in-law starts meddling. She marries Boaz. She has a son. His name is Obed. He has a son. His name is Jesse. And he has a son. His name is David, the king of Israel. And from him, we turn to Matthew. Matthew 1, chapter 1, 5 to 6, gives another genealogy. And Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. You get that? Boaz is the son of Rahab, the prostitute in Jericho. and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king, and David was the father of Salmon by the wife of Uriah. And then you jump down to verse 15, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. Boaz and Naomi have this gloriously ordinary life. They have a child. They worry about money and trash, and do they iron? I don't know. But it's that stuff that defines their life. Obed grows up. They take pride in him. They delight in him, and they have no earthly idea that from him comes a line of one who will save the world. The very promise that was given in Genesis 3, that the child that comes from Eve through a line of marriage will eventually crush the head of the serpent and redeem the world. Hope is going to come through marriage. Does that mean marriage is mandatory for all? No. But what we ought to be doing is celebrating it, encouraging it, and championing it. And we don't do that by laying expectations on it that it simply isn't called to bear. What we're called to do is to live a very ordinary life where we model Christ, we proclaim Christ, and in our performance, people see Christ. I have a little homework for you. I want you, when you get home, to find the eternal implement. It's not eternal, but it's old. Right? There are some things that just tend to stay in the house because they work. Now, in my home, growing up, it was a butter knife. Right? Now, we pronounced it a butter knife because there's T's in it, but right, it's a butter knife, and it had an ivory, or it was maybe just a bone handle, and we used it all the time. When you needed to take a piece of toast and put butter on it, we grabbed that knife out of the drawer. We grabbed it because it just worked really well, right? Nothing fancy about it, but it cut the butter well, it spread it well, it was the right weight, right size, we kept using it. I eventually left home, I come back years later, visit. In the meantime, the family has redone the kitchen, new counters, it looks great, open the drawer, same old butter knife, right? Because it's going to stay, it's one of those staples where, because it works, at this point, half of the one side of the bone is broken off. It doesn't look terribly nice, but it still works well. It's a wonderful story of how marriage operates from one generation to the next. It just works. It's not flashy. It's incredibly ordinary, but it works. So my encouragement to you is work towards an ordinary marriage that just works. It doesn't have to be exceptional. It's never going to be without pain. But for those of you who've been called to marriage and are married, in its ordinariness, make it work. For those of you who've not been called to marriage, nevertheless, encourage those who are. Encourage them in the ordinariness. That's where hope is found. Let's pray. Oh Lord, your word is so good for us and to us. As we consider your word, we are reminded that we live in the time of the judges. Oversized characters, dark days, and it's easy to lose hope. And then you give us Ruth and Boaz, and we're reminded yet again that you are working in the hidden places, in the ordinary things, and that marriage has this profound ability to transfer hope from one generation to the other, from one person to another. May we be mindful of that. May we be content in it. May we glory in it. In the ordinariness, you do extraordinary things. Amen.